After martial law was declared in the Philippines in 1972, and with the international oil crisis as justification, the dictator Ferdinand Marcos announced that among his flagship projects was the Chico River Basin Development Project, with funding to come from the World Bank. The proposal was to build 4 mega dams along the Chico River, 2 in the Mountain Province and 2 in Kalinga, to generate 650 megawatts of hydropower. There was no free, prior, and informed consent to the dam project, which would submerge villages and rice lands, displace whole communities, and adversely affect thousands of Bontoc and Kalinga indigenous peoples. In fact, the villages along the Chico River were not even informed about it. They learned of the project only when survey teams entered their ancestral territories. They were deeply disturbed by this aggression without any prior consultation or explanation. The indigenous villages along the Chico River that would be affected by the construction of the dams are tribal societies with an intricate network of peace pacts or budong, not only with their direct neighbors but extending over a wide area of associative relations. The news that huge dams were to be constructed along the Chico River soon spread through this indigenous socio-political system of the Budong or Peace Pact to many of the villages in the interior, many of which were not yet then reached by roads. Community meetings and Peace Pact conferences were called. The common theme in these gatherings was the great danger posed by the dams to the life, land, and honor of these indigenous communities along the Chico, and the need, therefore, to unite and resist, even unto death. The traditional Peace Pact is a bilateral agreement which governs the relations between 2 tribal communities. The life-threatening dams accelerated the process of social change in that it catalyzed the Binodngan or peace practicing communities along the Chico River to go into multilateral Budong agreements. The Presidential Assistant on National Minorities, Manuel Elizalde, was sent to Kalinga to coordinate efforts to minimize the opposition to Chico 4. Elizalde set up the Kalinga Special Development Region and tried to win support for the dam project by bringing in truckloads of canned goods, flashlights, basketballs, and chocolates to the villages he visited. When all of this did not work, he tried to bribe and co-opt some of the tribal elders in the classic tactic of divide and rule. He promised scholarships and developed a relocation area. He finally resorted to arming one tribe against the other with high-powered firearms, thus escalating the conflict. Direct confrontation and human barricades were the people's response wherever the National Power Corporation would try to set up their work camps. In one dramatic mass action, the Dupag villagers dismantled the NPC camp in Tomyangan, and the tribal men, women, and even children carried the construction materials and marched some 25 kilometers to dump these at the military camp in the provincial capital. In another instance, hundreds of community folk were herded and thrown into prison for refusing to vote in a staged referendum of the Marcos dictatorship. Kalinga was rapidly militarized as the Philippine military was brought in after Panamin was unable to convince the people to agree to the dam project. During this period, Many of the finest of the sons and even daughters of the indigenous communities joined the armed struggle of the New People's Army, which had expanded into the area after the dam issue broke out. On April 24, 1980, military troops of the Marcos dictatorship gunned down Makliing Dulag of the Butbut tribe in Bugnay, Tinglayan, Kalinga. Makliing was one of the outspoken critics of the opposition to the Chico dams. He was killed in the dead of night by the Philippine military in an effort to intimidate the indigenous opposition. Instead of being cowed, however, his death further solidified the resistance. In 1983, the Kalinga Bontoc Peace Pact Holders Association was organized in Buscalan, Tinglayan, Kalinga. The Budong Assembly was attended by peace pact holders and tribal elders from the dam-affected villages and their wider peace pact partners in another example of the transforming multilateral Budong. The KBPPHA later transformed into the Cordillera Budong Association in 1985. These indigenous peoples of Kalinga and Bontoc, considered by many as among the most neglected and powerless sectors of Philippine society, were able to stop development aggression of the Marcos dictatorship and the World Bank by asserting their collective human rights to ancestral land and self-determination. In their steadfast and uncompromising defense of their land, life, and honor, they earned the respect and support not only of the other indigenous peoples in the Cordillera, but also other progressive forces both in the Philippines and abroad. When they finally resorted to armed resistance after peaceful methods to seek redress of grievances had proved futile, this was but the next logical step for these warrior societies. The unfolding Chico drama ignited dormant Igorot nationalism. Igorot students and intellectuals put their energies into the more serious discussion and study of what it meant to be indigenous peoples and national minorities. Numerous activists and mass leaders espousing their rights as indigenous peoples emerged. The different Cordillera tribes were challenged into the recognition of the pressing need for a greater unity among themselves as indigenous peoples and as Filipinos. This increased self-awareness and conscientization among the indigenous peoples of the Cordillera paved the way towards a pan-Cordillera mass movement as it marked the shift from spontaneous reaction to conscious and concerted, unified action. As the different Igorot tribes and sectors were increasingly exposed to each other in mass meetings, intertribal activities, and Bodong conferences, there was the opportunity for dialogue and mutual sharing and learning. From here, the different tribes and sectors realized that they shared a common history of oppression, a common geography and territory, the Cordillera Mountain Range, a common persistence of indigenous cultures, although in varying degrees, common problems, and common enemies. Chico brought to the fore the fact that the present-day problems of tribal peoples and indigenous communities are much bigger and more complicated than any faced in earlier historical periods. More concretely, Chico showed the indigenous peoples of the Cordillera that their problems cannot be taken in isolation from the wider Philippine realities and the incursions of imperialist globalization. The common view of indigenous communities as traditionally conservative and resistant to change was proven wrong, as the Kalinga and Bontoc united with as broad an alliance as possible in defense of indigenous people's rights and against dictatorship. The people reaffirmed the tribal practice of total community mobilization in defense of life, land, and honor. Although the Chico resistance at the start was the spontaneous tribal response to outside threat. It soon positioned itself firmly within the front line of the anti-dictatorship and national democratic struggle. In February 1986, the Marcos dictatorship was ousted and Corazon Aquino assumed the presidency. The whole world recognized that people power had ousted the dictator Marcos. But not very many know that it was indigenous people's power that had effectively stopped the World Bank-funded Chico Dam project dead in its tracks.